very warm welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Aida Hairo and I'm based at the University of Leeds. As you know, this webinar is organized by the Center for International Business at University of Leeds, CEBUL, and Migration, Business and Society. Initially, this was supposed to be a webinar on the current state of research on migration in business and management, but pushed by the current context, we have slightly modified the focus. As the crisis in Ukraine continues and the world is turning its attention to the movement of people across borders, we business scholars must open new lines of inquiry if we are to maximize impact.
And also, hello on my side. My name is Milda Shinskrit. I'm based at Vienna University of Economics and Business. We are truly grateful to have wonderful speakers today. To maximize our time with them, we will not provide detailed biographies, although all of them are very accomplished and known in their fields. So first, Distinguished Professor of International Business at the University of Leeds and the founder of CEBUL Center, Peter Buckley, will give a few welcoming words. We will then hand over to three lead guest editors of upcoming special issues on migration: Raj Choudhury from Harvard University, Stacey Fitzsimmons from the University of Victoria in Canada, and Betina Szkudlarek, who is joining us from the University of Sydney in Australia, where it's 2 a.m. in the morning right now. So we're really grateful to have her here with us. And finally, we're also happy to share the presentation of Alexander Betts, Professor of Forced Migration and International Affairs at the University of Oxford, who will share his perspective on what business scholars could do to tackle the pressing challenges of forced migration at the moment. Unfortunately, Alex had a family emergency and he emailed us the recording of his presentation just about an hour ago, but we still hope that he'll be able to join us for the question and answer session at the end. And speaking of the Q&A, we would like to ask all the participants, feel free to post your questions in the chat for individual speakers. In the interest of time, Aida and I will collect those questions and we'll send the Q&A session to the end of today's webinar and address them at the end to all the speakers. And now, Peter, without further ado, we'll hand over to you for a quick welcome.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very prescient seminar on migration, humanitarian action and business. As was said, I'm Professor of International Business at the University of Leeds and the founder of CEBUL, which Aida is now the director of. CEBUL has a very distinguished record. It's been in the top 2 or 3 in the world and often first in international business. Our research has been on multinationals, on theory and strategy and impact of multinationals, particularly emerging market multinationals. Recently, we've focused on India and China. We've also worked on culture, on global value chains, managerial decision-making, and recently on the multinationals and the UN SDGs, and on policy. So we would regard ourselves as interested in policy, JIBP as well as JIBS. But we haven't done a massive amount on labor flows and on migration. Apart from some work on remittances, and remittances are a massive flow in the world economy and much neglected in international business. But as you'll have seen from the topics that I introduced there, all of them have a people element, they all have a labor element, and therefore they have a movement of people element. So it's fantastic that we can get involved in this. International business has a great record of looking at capital flows, mechanisms, institutions, policies, micro foundation of capital flows. And all these skills should be very useful in looking at flows of labor as well, on transferable skills, on migrants, on training and so on. So it's very much in the future grist to our mill, and I'm absolutely delighted that we can introduce this seminar and CEBUL can host this today. And I hope this is the start of a long engagement with this entirely relevant and pressing issue. So thank you for involving CEBUL in this. We're delighted to be here and looking forward very much to the seminar that's to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think I would like to now pass the floor to Raj. Please, Raj.
Thank you, Aida. I'll just share my slides. Can you see the slides? So first of all, thank you, Aida, Peter, and Milda for inviting me. I know many of the folks in the room, but for folks who don't know me, my name is Raj Choudhury. I am a professor at the Harvard Business School. And the first thing I should say is that I'm presenting on behalf of this wonderful team of special issue co-editors we have at OrgScience. So just to call out, and all of them are my friends or mentors. So Zeke at Wharton, Dan Wong at Columbia, Miles and Tarun, who are mentors to us, and Mary, who's one of the resident editors at OrgScience. So this is the special issue that we are currently managing, and the papers have been received. We have outstanding submissions. I want to say 75 papers were submitted, and many of them are really, really, really good. So I'm hoping we'll have a great special issue. And the reason I talk about this is that this is, as Peter said, really a progress we've made in the past 5 years to build a community of strategy, management, IB, and organizational scholars who study migration. So I just want to take a step back, and then I'll return to the special issue and talk about a conference that we've been running for many years now. So of course, immigration is a very topical issue. It's been topical forever. And it's been studied by economists and sociologists in their own respective fields. Many of the people in the room are experts on migration, so maybe I can skip this really quickly, but economists have taken a very labor econ view on wages and whether migrants affect the wages of natives. That's been one of the dominant questions. Sociologists like Alessandro Portes, on the other hand, at Princeton, have studied the migrant communities and the enclaves and the social capital that's formed within those enclaves. Now, the missing thing that we have always wondered for many years, and this is dating back to work by Bill Kerr and Mike Clemens and others, is what about the firm? Because neither the economists or the sociologists, I would say, have really studied immigration with the lens of the firm. And so this is a slide that I'm borrowing from my friend Zeke. But really, immigration affects all the resources that multinational firms care about. So of course, it affects labor, but we have shown in the research now that immigrants also affect capital flows into firms. And they also, my own personal research has been about how immigration affects knowledge and innovation outcomes within firms. So really what we're trying to do in this community is to bring the firm right at the center of the immigration research community. And that's the focus of the special issue. So it's a special issue about immigration and organizations. And more broadly, we have a conference now in its 5th year. And we started in a classroom in Wharton with 10 people 6 or 7 years back. And now it's grown to almost 80 people, I think, joined or applied for the last version. So that conference hopefully will keep doing. So please send your papers. There'll be a call for papers very soon for this year in the fall. So please attend that conference, and hopefully this will be an ongoing dialogue. So what I will do in my last few minutes is just quickly summarize some of the work that Dan, Zeke, Elena, and myself, we have done in the field, because we are trying to build this community. So Dan has done very interesting work on return migration and brokerage. He has a wonderful paper in the ASQ, which many of you probably know. He's also got a paper in the Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal, which is also very interesting on the same topic of return migrants and entrepreneurship outcomes. Zeke and Elena, and Zeke on his own has worked on how migrants tap into networks, their personal networks, to affect firm performance. So Zeke has a wonderful paper in the ASQ. Elena and Zeke together have a paper in OrgScience. My focus has been through multiple papers to think about how geographic mobility and migration, both cross-border and within the country, affects innovation outcomes. So I've studied return migrants and their effect on local R&D in the paper in the Journal of Economic Geography. In the OrgScience paper, I look at how short-term travel between countries affect innovation outcomes. In the research policy paper, we look at how migrants affect innovation outcomes at the level of the country. And then the SMJ piece looks at how ethnic migrants affect knowledge transfer, and knowledge recombination. And then I'll just make a quick plug for two new papers, relatively new papers, and I'll stop. So there's a new paper forthcoming in management science, where we introduce the idea of a firm-induced migration path, that the firm is really moving a lot of people around. And so this paper looks at within-country migration. And one of the main findings here is that when firms move workers from smaller towns to a cluster in India, there are two effects. First, there's an increased performance because the firm is finding really talented workers in the smaller towns. But on the flip side, these workers are more likely to join a competitor because now they have the outside option for the first time in their lives. So firm-induced migration paths with lots of, I guess, salience for what's happening in the world right now. And the last thing I'll show is I also have this other stream of research which is opening up, which I call work from anywhere. And to me, work from anywhere is really a migration. I view it through the lens of migration, because work from anywhere is when workers choose where to move. So instead of the firm deciding where the person should move and work and live, the individual decides where to move to and where to live. And so I view remote work through the lens of migration. And in this paper in SMJ, I studied how the patent examiners at the USPTO, what happened to their productivity when the USPTO allowed them to move to their chosen preferred locations. And so that's all I have for today. Happy to engage on questions, and thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Raj, for joining us. I know that people probably have questions for you, and Aida and I have had a question to you about work from anywhere for a long time now. However, we will keep that until the end, and I'll hand over now to Stacey from University of Victoria, once again joining us from Canada. So Stacey, over to you.
Thanks so much, Milda. Thanks so much for having me here. So similar to what Raj was just presenting, I'm also editing a special issue on the topic. However, our special issue is in the Journal of International Business Studies. So it's looking specifically at the role of global mobility of people for, excuse me, international organizations, or even more specifically for the multinational enterprise. For our special issue, and you can see the other special issue editors on the screen here, our question that we're addressing is, how does the global mobility of people influence the spread, activities, and performance of the multinational enterprise? We're just getting back the first round of R&Rs, so I'm pretty excited about the papers that we've had from this special issue. You'll see the outcome in the next year or so. But for the sake of today's webinar, because we're talking about humanitarian refugees or refugee employees, I'm making this somewhat provocative claim. And the claim here is that multinational enterprises are particularly well positioned to integrate and benefit from refugee employees. And so you can see there's two parts to this argument. On the right-hand side, and that's the part I'm going to start with, is the argument that multinational enterprises, their competitive environment makes them particularly well positioned to benefit from hiring refugee employees. And on the left-hand side, I'll get to that in a minute or two, is that they are well positioned to integrate refugee employees, largely because they already have the capacity to do so, because they're so well versed in integrating employees who migrate across borders. So we're going to start on the benefit side of things. As Raj already pointed out, right, there's extensive literature that migration or moving people across borders has benefits for firms in terms of creativity, innovation, knowledge flow, and knowledge transfer. These arguments are so well established that I don't really need to go over them here. I've highlighted a couple of articles that just illustrate how the benefits don't only accrue to the person who is migrating, but also to the firm at large. So for example, the article on the right by Raj, right, talks about how the the patents were increased not only by the person who returned as a migrant, but also to their subordinates, the people that were managed by a returnee. And on the left-hand side is an article that establishes how and why it occurs. So this one was done in the semiconductor industry, and they found that patents increased among Indian inventors who were very well embedded in an co-ethnic Indian community. And it was done through connections and through knowledge flow, although there was diminishing returns at very, very high levels of embeddedness. But when you move on from these arguments about how the benefits to the firm are established through innovation and creativity, we can also see how it happens through human resource management practices. So overall, across these three studies that I'm referring to here is a story that multinational enterprises can benefit by strategically employing people who are often marginalized domestically, such as refugee employees. So on the far right-hand side of the screen is a research study that found that female migrants are particularly susceptible to suffering from brain waste. So they migrate, but their skills, talents, and abilities are often not recognized by the firms that employ them. In the middle of the screen is a study that found that multinational enterprises operating in South Korea, that they actually experienced performance gains by strategically employing women who were often treated reasonably poorly by domestic firms. And on the far left-hand side of the screen is another study that was done in Latin America. And they found that people who were often marginalized domestically, they gravitated towards multinational enterprises, in part because they recognized their knowledge, skills, and abilities would be more likely to be recognized in those internationally oriented firms. So all told, this tells a story that multinational enterprises might have an opportunity to see refugee employees as a source of talent that they can use to improve their own performance by improving their knowledge flows, their innovation, and their access to community networks that they might not otherwise have access to. However, there's also the story about the flip side story. And this is the story that multinational enterprises are often among the most well-resourced and economically important organizations in countries that are fragile or conflict-ridden. So I really like this paper because it makes the argument that multinational enterprises are well suited to helping people meet their basic needs in their home countries, to avoiding the need for them to migrate away or to be forced away. For example, they cite a study that they had done earlier in Sri Lanka, where there's a long-standing conflict between the Tamilese minority and the Sinhalese majority. And they found that there are some firms that offered what they called conflict-sensitive HR practices. So these included some things like offering some sort of emotional and material support to employees who are going through really challenging times, or also providing ethnically diverse teams at work. So this means teams that straddled this ethnic divide that was going on in the country, along with some really purposeful messaging about why they were doing so. And what they found is that not only did they have very high levels of commitment among their employees, but it also tended to reduce the ethnic tension that occurred in the workplace, and it increased knowledge sharing across these ethnic lines. So you can imagine that this is beneficial not only for the firm, but also the benefits might bubble outside of the firm to actually reduce the kind of ethnic tension that they had in those countries. This is a story that multinational enterprises may have a role to play in peace building. So that's, a very tip of the iceberg of the argument on the right-hand side of the screen, that multinationals may be very well positioned to benefit from the international connections, knowledge, and creativity that refugee employees can bring. On the left-hand side of the screen, I'm making the argument now that they're already well positioned because they already have the capacity to do this. They're experts in moving people across borders and integrating them into their workplace. So, for example, these two papers were both published in the Journal of International Business Studies in 2022, so hot off the presses. And they both make very similar arguments. They say that the benefits that accrue from migrant employees, from people who move across borders, depend on how well people are managed. On the right-hand side of the screen, you've got a theory paper that challenges the assumption that individual creativity and knowledge benefits automatically accrue to the organization. Instead, they make the argument that it really depends on unit level processes that help to build the individual's creativity into a unit level or firm level benefit. On the left-hand side of the screen is an ethnographic study that I personally adore, and I really encourage all of you to check it out. Haejung Hong, who's the first author on this paper, she spent a year in each of two multinational organizations headquartered in France, and together with Dana Mbeba, they ended up finding that the HR, what they call the HR architecture of the firm, is the determining factor about whether they can receive the benefits of the migrant individuals, what they call multicultural individuals, but are essentially people who have access to more than one cultural environment. So for example, one of the firms in their study, they talked about how they were strategically placing multicultural individuals into departments where their skills were most likely to be beneficial. They said that the migrants mainly work in 3 different departments: in new product development, international marketing, and international recruitment. Another example from a Polish-French manager at one of the studies, and this was done in a beauty industry, said that she still loves certain products because she used to get them on the black market. So using their migrant employees' knowledge to understand how their consumers would look at some of their products. However, there is finally a cautionary tale to be told about how to manage refugee employees. In this paper, we got the acceptance notice yesterday, so it's hot off the presses, this one. And I see my 2 co-authors are in the meeting today. So hi to Robin and Ebru. In this study, we interviewed 127 refugees, colleagues, managers, HR managers across 28 different German firms. And this was during the Syrian refugee crisis. And we found one of our controversial claims that we found is that managers who hire refugees often do so for humanitarian reasons. They want to do good. They're trying to be the best person they can be and help others. However, managers who used this approach were often not the most effective from the refugees' perspective. For example, this is a quote from one of our refugee employees in our sample, talking about his manager. "She wants to control everything in my life. I can't stand it any longer. If I had known that before, I never would have started the job." So you can see that managers who were trying to be humanitarians often got overly involved in their employees' lives, and the refugees had such little agency over their lives already that they often felt like they couldn't say no. And so the argument in this paper that we're making is that often managers who approach it from a pragmatic perspective of being a good manager, supporting effectively, but also not getting overly and inappropriately involved in your employees' lives tends to be the most effective. So the conclusion here is that research that's being done in psychology, in social work, in other disciplines, I found that they often take what's called a trauma-informed lens, which is wonderful. And I'm really glad that they do that. We need to keep doing that. What I want to encourage is for international business researchers to look at refugee employees also from a talent lens, and to test whether multinational enterprises are particularly well positioned to benefit from and to integrate refugee employees.
Thank you very much, Stacey, for this very insightful presentation. I think now next presenter is Betina, who is joining us from Sydney at, I believe, 3 a.m., 4 a.m. in the morning. Thank you very much, Betina, for being with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, first of all. And I would like to start by acknowledging the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'm speaking from today in Australia, and I would like to pay my respect to the past, present, and emerging people who own this land and to whom this land always will remain. I'm extremely honored to be surrounded with such a wonderful list and group of presenters, but also what I noticed, a very accomplished list of participants. So I recognize the many names from work that you are doing. Some of you I know personally, so thank you so much for taking the time to be here and to committing to this very important issue. Today, I'm also, like other speakers, representing a whole group of amazing scholars. Alexander Newman from Deakin, Hans van Dijk from Tilburg, Katja, who I think I could see her being present. Thank you so much for joining. And Snezhina Mihailova from Auckland. This is an amazing group of colleagues who share not just the passion for supporting refugee workforce integration, but also for providing tangible solutions to some of those urgent challenges we are seeing. And I think this is exactly what's reflected in our special issue. We are just like Stacey in the stage where we are getting slowly the first R&Rs back, with the focus on effective strategies for refugees, employment, inclusion, and integration. We really are trying to stress the importance of the fact that this is one of those research contexts, where we really need to think more than just about advancing theory, but we really need to think about how our theory can inform practice. So I'll follow up very briefly from what Stacey just said, which is there is a lot that employers can do, but I'll take a little bit of a provocative look and stress the importance of what can we do, not just from the perspective of the multinational, but also from the perspective of individual refugees who are the ones who are affected by our choices. Now, I couldn't, of course, start if I didn't recognize what's happening at the moment in Ukraine. And I would like to thank all the friends all over Europe, who probably many of you are here today, who are supporting this humanitarian cause. I have been personally involved heavily with quite a few actions happening directly at the border. One of my best friends is coordinating the intake in Przemysl, which is the city that has received probably the largest amount of Ukrainian refugees. So thank you for everyone that is contributing to the cause, and every little tiny bit of help really, really makes a difference. So if you still can do something, anything, please do. Don't treat the war as yesterday's news, as I feel is slowly becoming here in Australia. Now, what I wanted to very briefly talk about is the role that international business, international management has in tackling some of those major socioeconomic and political challenges, such as refugee workforce integration. And my kind of adventure with this particular topic started back in 2017 when the Syrian humanitarian emergency was unfolding in our eyes. And the fact that I noticed at that stage, together with my colleague Luciana Nardon, that there is very little that international business, international management, or management as such has done to actually tackle this challenge, to talk about what refugees face. And we noticed that there was a very strong path dependence in terms of what choices we make about our research and how we approach the research questions. We took therefore back then the lens of expatriates and refugees and showed them that on this extreme continuum on international transition, those two groups bring very different insights and very different assumptions about the role of business, about the role of context, about the role of individuals and their freedom, their agency in the process. So we noticed very quickly that focusing on refugees, while an important and relevant topic that we all should be paying attention to, also brings a lot of theory boost to our theorizing, because it opened eyes to perspectives which were so different than the one that governed the field so far. So this is where we started to argue that refugees and international mobility is a very important research topic we need to bring into our attention to make sure that our theories and our theorizing is actually relevant to what is happening today. But jumping to where we are today, we see that the disconcerting silence is not anymore there. We see more engagement of international business, international management in the work on refugees. But what we see now are the urgently needed solution. And what we noticed, both in terms of work on the ground with multinational corporations and social enterprises supporting them, as well as from theory development, that there is a new path dependence emerging, and that part dependence is really driven by what we borrow a concept from sociology of market citizenship, which means people who receive our attentions are those who seem to be the most valuable from the labor market perspective. We saw initially expatriates, the attention moving to skilled migrants, and now we see predominantly attention focused on skilled refugees. We know that refugees face a very, very complex set of barriers that we label as canvas selling. But what we see that is the most vulnerable groups of refugees who are left behind. And we see a lot of research that emerges on skilled refugees, and we see a lot of employers, because that's the research domain I am engaged in, who are interested in highly skilled refugees, with the vulnerability being the main criteria on which individuals are allowed to enter a given receiving country. I think it's really important as scholars that we see our responsibility to not only advance theory, but to really advance employment outcomes and therefore chance for decent livelihood to those individuals, those refugees who need our support most. So I'm kind of ending on a more personal pledge in here that I think it's turn for the field of international management to turn our attention not just to those who are valuable for the employers, but also to those who need our attention most and therefore can present their benefits to employers. So I look forward to hearing more from everyone else. And again, thank you to all of you who directed their research attention to this important topic.
So I don't know if I'll pronounce this right, but bardzo dziękuję, Betina. Thank you so much one more time. I would now hand over to Alex, but as I said, he sent us his recording and big apologies for not being able to make it at this moment. So I will try to share his recording and hope everything will work well on my screen. Okay, so greetings from Alexander Betts from the University of Oxford.
Hello, I'm delighted to be able to join you and only sorry I can't be there in person. What I want to be able to do in this brief presentation is talk a little bit about how I think about the relationship between refugees and business. And I'm going to situate that in a larger body of work that I do, which is really about the economic lives of refugees. To think about refugees as not only humanitarian victims, but also economic actors involved in production, consumption, as borrowers, as lenders, as entrepreneurs. And it's those aspects of the economic lives of refugees that my research is particularly focused on. And that, of course, has implications for business and the way in which we study business's role in relation to migration. To contextualize, I've recently published a book called The Wealth of Refugees, How Displaced People Can Build Economies. And as you probably guessed, the title of the book is a play on the title of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. And it reflects upon the fact that in the intervening 250 years since Smith's book, one of the founding texts in modern economics, was published, there's been relatively little work by economists thinking about the economic lives of people who fall outside the framework of the nation state, whether as refugees or exiles. And so this book isn't just an economics book, it's a book that tries to think about the political economy of how refugees can be enabled and supported to be contributors to the economies that they're part of, not just seen as a burden in the way that receiving societies, politicians, policymakers often portray them to be, but they can actually contribute. And in that book, I draw upon a wider body of work that I've done with colleagues in Oxford called the Refugee Economies Programme. And there's a link here to resources and research that we do in that work. And it's not just focusing on business, it's interdisciplinary work, drawing upon economics, political science, anthropology, but it is work that has implications for business and the way in which we study the relationship between business and migration. The starting point for that work is really to think about refugee issues not just as a humanitarian issue, not just as about delivering food, clothing and shelter to vulnerable people, but also as a development issue, as an issue for the economy. And very often, the conception of refugees has been of victims in need of assistance. And that's important. In the emergency phase, we need to be able to deliver to people in need their most urgent needs. But beyond that emergency phase, what we often neglect about refugees is they need some form of socioeconomic integration, access to public services like health and education, access to the opportunity to work and engage in meaningful work. And around the world, that's often forgotten by the humanitarian agencies that traditionally serve refugees. And refugees can be stuck in refugee camps in limbo for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Even in rich countries, refugees can get stuck in a form of dependency trap, indefinitely dependent on assistance. And it doesn't have to be that way. As we move to the medium and long term, we have to plan for socioeconomic integration, whether people are going to stay or return ultimately to their countries of origin when it's safe to do so. Now, until recently at least, 85% of the world's refugees have been hosted by low and middle income countries. They're in countries like Iran and Pakistan in the case of Afghans, Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon in the case of Syrians, countries like Kenya, Uganda in the case of South Sudanese, and countries like Colombia and Ecuador in the case of Venezuelans. So it's predominantly those low and middle income countries that host the majority of the world's refugees, or it has been until the Ukraine war took place. And most exile remains protracted, lasting sometimes decades. And the problem is there's the absence of what are called durable solutions. People can't always go home. They can't get permanent integration into the country they're part of. They can't get resettled, so they get stuck. But rather than them getting stuck, there's been an increasing focus by the international community on what's called self-reliance or livelihoods, effectively economic opportunity for refugees. So in my work, I ask, how can those development-based approaches be effective? And a key part of that has to be for business. We've done surveys with over 16,000 refugees and nearby host community members in 3 refugee hosting countries in East Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda. And these were 3 countries that, until recently, hosted at least as many refugees as the whole of the European Union combined. We've done participatory mixed methods research in camps and cities, a very wide-ranging survey to allow us to look at correlations across different aspects of refugees' economic lives, looking at what explains variation in entrepreneurship, what explains variation in income, in assets, expenditure, subjective well-being, food security, etc. And we've used that data set to look at 3 sets of questions, 3 quite related questions. Questions about welfare, when do refugees thrive rather than survive? Questions around social cohesion, when do refugees and host communities get along with one another? And questions about mobility, when do refugees stay where they are or move onwards? And there are a range of key findings that I think are very relevant for business. We find that development-based approaches can be win-win. So investment can benefit refugees, but also host communities and nearby societies. Jobs and education are crucial in relation to all 3 of these main questions. So access to employment and education, including vocational training, shapes variation in income levels and various aspects of welfare. Access to economic opportunity and shared economic opportunity shapes how host communities feel about refugees and vice versa. And in relation to mobility, we actually find some evidence that people are less likely to leave the host country of first asylum or move onwards if they've got access to sustainable economic opportunities. So even onward migration is not inevitable. We've done a series of impact evaluations. In Ethiopia, we looked at a really exciting case of the 5 Doloado camps that have received the largest private sector investment in the history of the refugee system, around $100 million from the IKEA Foundation. And a big part of that funding has been spent on a cooperative model for refugees and the host community's livelihoods. Cooperatives, shared group-based income-generating activities designed to stimulate business generation have been developed in agriculture, livestock, and retail. And we've shown how they've led to improved income levels, improved refugee-host relations, and been an example of effective private sector collaboration between the United Nations Refugee Agency and a corporate foundation trying to support the flourishing of small and medium-sized enterprises and entrepreneurship. There have been limitations, though. They've still only been able to reach and provide employment for around 10% of the overall adult population of the camps in those target sectors. And programs without market linkages to local markets, to regional markets, have been the ones that have failed. So the cooperative model has been an interesting one, but we found that to bring really sustainable transformation, macroeconomic transformation is needed rather than just microeconomic interventions. Circulating aid money in different ways is no substitute for investment in infrastructure, large-scale job creation, and business investment. Another project I've been involved in that involves business is the Jordan Compact, which was an agreement between the government of Jordan, the European Union, and the World Bank to support the right to work for Syrian refugees in Jordan after the 2015-16 crisis. And Jordan's commitment was to create the right to work for refugees in Jordan. And ultimately, the scheme has been successful in providing 200,000 work permits for Syrians in a country where the right to work previously didn't exist. Crucially, it enabled Syrian businesses previously located in Syria to operate in Jordan's pre-existing special economic zones. Now, there were limitations to this scheme, which provided concessionary finance from the World Bank, trade concessions from the European Union for businesses exporting and employing refugees within Jordan's special economic zones. Those are successes, but there have also been limits. A lack of investment by multinational corporations. Some companies invested in the special economic zones, like Walmart, IKEA, for instance, doing supply chain, using refugee workers. But one of the challenges was the lack of prior socioeconomic studies to understand the communities on their own terms, for instance, in terms of the gender relationships of employment and labour market access. The access to labour markets has been limited to particular sectors, notably textiles, construction and agriculture. But the key takeaways are this offered a pilot to learn about public-private collaboration, about how governments and intergovernmental organisations could support the right to work and support business investment in a way that led to employment opportunities for refugees and host communities. In Colombia, I've done work advising the presidency of Colombia with support from the United States. Colombia has created a temporary integration scheme for its 1.7 million Venezuelan refugees. Those refugees have been widely distributed across urban areas. Most have been labelled as externally displaced rather than refugees. But Colombia has been pioneering in offering a regularization program based on a permit called the PEP, which allows refugees the right to work, allows them access to public services, and it's been generalized to the whole Venezuelan population in 2021. The UN Refugee Agency has worked with the government to create solidarity summits, but one of the key parts that's been missing, arguably, is business engagement, to work with business associations, to work with multinational corporations, to create employment opportunity for refugees and host communities alongside one another to make this sustainable. What does all this mean for the contemporary situation in Ukraine? Business has a very important role to play. The solidarity we've seen across Europe has been extraordinary over the past 6 weeks. We've seen incredible support, everyday humanitarianism, donors, people showing a commitment to support refugee rights. But what's going to become increasingly important in countries that host the majority of Ukrainians, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, is that hosting refugees becomes sustainable. Regardless of the scenarios that could unfold in Ukraine, many Ukrainians will be present in those countries for a long time. And it's going to be crucial that they are supported with investment around jobs and around public services like education and in health. And the receiving communities, those areas that receive large numbers of Ukrainians, are going to need socioeconomic support and shared access and opportunity for employment and work if hosting is going to be sustainable and if we're to avoid the kind of public backlash we saw in the aftermath of 2015 and 16 across Europe. It's worth noting that many of those host countries have high unemployment rates, particularly high youth unemployment rates. They've been economically affected by COVID. And even though there is solidarity towards immediate neighbouring countries, we've seen in the past that even in Europe and even in Central and Eastern Europe, there's sometimes the potential for xenophobic attitudes towards others coming from the wider geographical Europe region. So business is going to have a key role to play there. In conclusion, what does this mean for the way we study the role of business? Well, some of the things that I'd reflect on from my work are we need to think through who the key actors are within businesses. That it's not just about those in corporate social responsibility departments or those working on sustainability issues that we should think about, but also board level decision making. the role that C-level decision-making can and should play in engaging with refugees. We should also think about the regions where businesses invest. It's been very challenging to get businesses to invest in low and middle income countries. There's a lot of reticence to invest in fragile regions of the world, and much more positivity about investing in North America and Europe, for instance. Some of that investment in Europe is obviously very important now, but we need to keep that larger framework and ask what the different challenges are for business investment. The scale is also something we should keep in mind. A lot of the focus has often been on MNCs, but SMEs and entrepreneurs are a really important source of opportunity for refugees. What about the motives of business? How can we understand them? How can we study them? Access to labour is a key part. Supply chain is another key part of what motivates involvement. Brand has been a key part, and reputation. We also lack actors in the space who can effectively facilitate dialogue between the humanitarian system and business. Two organisations that have tried, in some cases effectively, to do that are the International Finance Corporation, the World Economic Forum, but humanitarian actors are not used to facilitating these conversations. So how does dialogue take place, and where is the leadership to bring business into the humanitarian space? Collaboration is one way to achieve that, and public-private partnership is extremely important, particularly around areas of innovative finance, supporting infrastructure in refugee hosting regions, and ensuring things like impact investment bonds can be conceived as creative ways to crowdfunding into this area. So I've just shared some initial thoughts, and I hope they are useful.
All right, so once again, we're happy to at least be able to share Alexander's presentation. Aida?
Yeah, so many thanks to everybody. This was very insightful. I would like to ask a question, Peter, a question. Sorry, Peter, about putting you in the spotlight. So Alex showed the example of Jordan and how the government and intergovernmental organizations were working together with the private sector to establish an economic zone that employed refugees. Yeah. And the major limitations he mentioned were the lack of investment by multinational companies, except the two examples, IKEA and Walmart. And the second aspect was sociocultural integration of refugees. So this sounds like the exact two areas where we as business scholars have expertise and could contribute. Would you like to share any thoughts on this, as somebody who pioneered the IB field and the work on multinationals, or how else could we get more involved? And
yes, indeed. If you can hear me, my camera has stopped working for some reason. I can't put it back on. I think the point that was made there, and the point that many analysts have made over the years, is it is very difficult to encourage multinationals in highly volatile and difficult situations to invest. And often you need partnerships to be able to do that. You need insurance guarantees, and you need people to be able to support the normal activities of multinationals. I think the thing that the host country can do is to look at ways of encouraging multinationals to come there that are perhaps slightly unconventional, offering them guarantees or underwriting them and so on. The whole aspect of multinationals employing refugees and disadvantaged people is where do they do it? Do they do it in the host country where the people are, or do they transfer people out? And we've talked, I think a number of people have talked about the costs and benefits and the disadvantages of kind of removing people versus trying to provide investment in the country. And those are extremely interesting factors. I think the other thing that we haven't perhaps touched on yet is the role of civil society in all this, because a lot of people have talked about the change in attitude of multinationals. And I think one of the key reasons for that is the pressure that civil society is putting on multinationals to get them to change their objectives and to move away from perhaps being owned towards a stakeholder approach rather than a simple shareholder approach. So I think there's quite a lot going on, but I think as yet we haven't seen the full benefit of multinationals being fully brought in as players, and there are obstacles there.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think I'll pass to Milda now.
So I see a lot of activity happening in the chat, and I'm so glad that the speakers are engaging with participants directly. So that is great. I actually just wanted to follow up because the first question was posed by Marius, and that triggered quite some comments and thoughts. So maybe follow up on that question very quickly with Raj, because he may also need to leave us for another meeting soon. And then I'll try to combine the other questions that we've seen in the chat, and Aida will help me out there too. But Raj, you posted the comment or link to your article about work from anywhere also. And I believe we saw your earlier article about how that may contribute to the decrease in brain drain in the lower income countries. But a follow-up question of that would be, what could work from anywhere future result in for the actual high income societies that rely on high skilled immigrants? So for example, here in Austria, we just saw the labor minister recently posting a comment on LinkedIn that they desperately need 170,000 highly skilled migrants to bring them after the COVID. And we just wonder if this will happen or people will stay in their home countries, and how could that possibly change the big picture scale?
No, thank you, Milda. That's a great question. So it's a topic I think about all the time now. And so my big picture response is, I feel work from anywhere is going to lead to a spatial redistribution of talent. So it's not that migration will go down, we'll just see new patterns of migration. So instead of firms requiring or determining the destination of workers, in many cases, the individual worker now has more agency in deciding where to go. And that might lead to even increased migration. So I'll give you one quick example. So one phenomena that I'm fascinated by and I'm studying very deeply is this whole spate of countries around the world. By last count, I had 36 countries offering digital nomad visas. So these are special category visas where they want to attract workers who can work remotely, who can work from anywhere. And these workers are being incentivized with tax breaks and all kinds of other incentives by different countries. So this is Germany, Brazil, Estonia, Barbados, Indonesia. I'm working with the government in Italy on this topic. So I feel high income countries can now actually attract talent through mechanisms such as digital nomad visas. But you're right, there will be some return migration, both from developed countries to emerging markets, but also within the country, I expect some return migration from the over-congested cities to the smaller towns. So overall, I feel it's going to be a spatial redistribution of talent, and potentially it's a win-win for countries, for large cities, for small towns, and for the workers themselves and for companies. So the link I posted just very quickly is not to the Work from Anywhere article. It's a different article. It's actually now published in the Annals, where I summarize the literature on migration, the barriers to migration, and then I talk about work from anywhere and how work from anywhere can mitigate some of the barriers to migration. But thanks for asking that.
Thank you so much. A lot food for thought, really. Maybe I could also ask Betina next to follow-up question on the role of MNCs in actually remote employment of refugees, if you could enlighten us on that a bit.
Thank you, Milda. I think it's a fascinating topic and a really one that deserves so much more attention than it currently has received. The World Economic Forum a number of years ago called for creating more remote opportunities of employment for refugees. Many of them who are stranded in refugee camps actually through different donations have access to computers, are ready to work here and now. And I think that's such a wonderful opportunity for MNCs to tap into a talent, but it's even greater opportunity for refugees to give them a chance to rebuild their life and economic independence. So again, the World Economic Forum called for that many years ago. Not much is happening in this space, but I think this is one of those notions that we should be paying more attention to now that we are all used to working from home. How can we make sure that our employment solution are flexible and adjusting to this new reality in a way that also addresses some of those, major migration challenges.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm really trying to catch up with the chat right now. I know, so does Aida. Again, we see so many conversations that seem to go hand in hand. So I'll just try to summarize, and I'm sorry if I'm leaving anybody out, but it seems that comments by Andreas, Gilles, and Chi were kind of in the same line of thought. And this is moving away from the work from anywhere future and digitalization. And more general question that we'll ask both Stacey and Betina. So Andreas phrased it this way. He said, all speakers seem to highlight benefits of migration for the firm, such as innovation, creativity, etc. But how about the challenges of migration, whether forced or not, to the firm, such as managing diverse workforce? And then we know that Gilles followed up on that, saying that perhaps the new incomers do not always have the ready skills that the MNCs need. This will maybe go more to the refugee integration. And a similar comment from Chi, and we focus more on the challenges as illustrated in the global sustainability goals of the UN 2030. So maybe Stacey, first over to you, and then to Betina, build on those challenges.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for asking. And I really appreciate the discussion happening in the chat here. Somebody, and sorry, I don't remember who, pointed out that more research about the benefits to individuals themselves is taking place often in HR discipline, like the IJHRM does a lot of that work. I see Jelena Zikic is here today, and her work is fantastic in this area. Let's see, in terms of building capacity for refugee employees, somebody asked, kind of how would that happen, or what would happen when you have employees who don't have the skills, talents, and abilities ready yet to do the work. And I'll give an example from the paper that I discussed in my presentation, the one that's coming out in Organizational Dynamics. So in that study, Robin and Ebru, who are here in the meeting today, they went and they talked with German firms. There's one in particular that was taking a really unique approach. So this was a German manufacturing firm, and they train employees over a 2-year period in cohorts. And what they decided to do during the height of the Syrian refugee crisis, they wanted to do their part. And so they designated one cohort a year that would be just refugees. And they decided to do this so that they could offer additional support as needed to the refugees, and also that they would build a community rather than having, say, refugees dispersed among all of their training cohorts. They had one that was just refugees, and that would allow them to offer additional support as needed. So this study was in part a way to examine what was working, what wasn't in terms of this approach, but I think it's a really great approach to think about how to offer this kind of training for employees and see what they need. Betina, I know you've done a lot of research, and you've got probably even more examples about how it can be done.
Thank you, Stacey. We do indeed. And actually, we are working with one of the large multinationals that is employing a large number of refugees. And that number is very diverse in terms of their backgrounds. Those individuals, some of them are highly skilled, some of them not so much. So we've been working with a multinational, looking at how they approach preparing the local workforce to exactly overcome the challenges that have been asked about. And we found that while the hiring, the company did it in a very smart way, which is they didn't hire all of the cohorts at the same time. They staged the hiring across a year or 2 years, which meant from the first cohort, the insights that the research provided that included preparation for the local workforce meant that they have learned a lot about what worked and didn't work for that successful integration for both the refugees and the receiving colleagues at the existing workplace. And they readjusted their trainings. And we talk about readjustment at the very micro level, in which how do you bond and how do you create a connection that you would normally create with a colleague, with someone who is culturally very diverse, who might have gone through very traumatic experiences. So they discuss literally a micro level questions you could be asking a refugee that you could feel comfortable asking without possibly engaging into too much detail of something they might not be comfortable with, but yet questions that are kind of personal enough that you can build that connection. And what we are finding in this research, which is also interesting, is that there is so much care and attention and sensitivity that almost leads to barrier to that, cohesion in the workplace, because despite the following cohorts being informed more about the importance of build connection, just treat your, newcoming refugee colleague as one of other colleagues, people are very reluctant to ask even questions about how their weekend was. And that creates, of course, big barriers to integration. So there is a big role of individuals, of what Peter talked before, the public opinion and how we think, refugees coming into our countries and how we welcome them and how we, on individual levels, see them just like anyone else could have been at that given moment, but we were lucky not to be. But yet we want someone to just reach out as a human being who is searching for connection and a community and a group. So yes, absolutely a critical topic, trying to make sure that you don't just prepare and invest in the employability of refugees, but you also invest in the receiving part of the equation, in employees who will be working with refugees. And again, we have some employers who tell us very openly that there are some workforces where they would really be hesitant to bring any diversity, any cultural diversity that, just not refer to refugees, and that there is a lot of groundwork that needs to happen in relation to what media and how media presents culturally diverse people and refugees in particular, and what's the role of government narrative around that, and how refugees are being used by political sides in their fights for power, and how we should not demonize them in that conversation, but instead create an environment where the public opinion will be much more receptive to seeing refugees as very, very unlucky, humans out there who we could be in the same shoes as they are.
So I'm getting overwhelmed by all the questions in the chat. So I just saw that one interesting question popped up, but maybe Milda can take this one. And I have another question related also, because the topic of the webinar was, where do we stand and where should we be heading? And Betina has edited, I think it's the second special issue on refugees, and Stacey is editing a special issue in Journal of International Business, which is a premier journal in international business. Could you let me, if it's possible, know what are the type of submissions where you believe you have a lot around the specific topics, and what are the type of topics where you have wished to receive more submissions? So,
okay, Betina, I'll go first on this one. So in terms of the JIBS tends to have a lot of expertise and historically international business in general in expatriation, right? That's traditionally what IB considers when they think about global mobility. And as a few of you have mentioned in the chat, that's changing. Right now, we tend to think about mobility and migration across the power and status spectrum, and not only about these particularly high paid, high status, high power employees who are migrating across borders, often with extensive firm support. So, and admittedly, the submissions that we received at JIBS did trend towards that traditional view of mobility. And we have an overrepresentation of research that's looking at expatriation and an underrepresentation of research in IB, in international business, that's examining refugees, that's examining low power or low status or low skilled employees. Migrant employees, and that's the direction that I'm really hoping that we move in the future. So, for example, I've got a chapter coming out soon. I forget what the book is called and who's publishing it, but it's coming out soon in a handbook of international business, where we argue that, together with my PhD student Amina Tmuibi, that we're changing the metaphor of migration. Traditionally, in international business, the metaphor has been one of river flows, where in scale, it's small scale, right? A river is quite small in terms of the flow of people. And also the direction tends to be linear, right? Sometimes there's return migration, right? But in general, it's going to be between the home country and the host country, and possibly maybe back again. That's quite a limited idea of what migration means in international business. And we're arguing that instead we need to be moving from river flows metaphor to tidal flows metaphor, where in terms of scale, it's a very large scale, right? Flows happening across oceans instead of rivers, and also multi-directional. people often move through transit countries on their way to where they ultimately end up, and may move to other countries in addition to that. And we're really excited to expand our what we think about in international business beyond the very narrow category of expatriates to a much wider perspective. I see some of this work happening in value chain research, right, where they're looking at, because especially people lower in the value chain are often migrant employees. Also, agricultural work relies heavily on migrant employees. And these are fields where I'm really looking forward to seeing more research about migration in international business.
Thank you, Stacey. I don't know if Betina would like to add something, or we could proceed.
Stacey gave a really great overview. I think, our specialization was slightly different because we specifically focus on humanitarian migrants. And what we noticed with most of the submissions is that, which is a great thing, which is that the people who submitted the papers are passionate about supporting refugees. But that means that with the passion of how they conducted research and what they focused on, the contribution to theory was the part they struggled with. And I think that's something where what I see in the current field and how we make sense of refugee workforce integration, we have to move from the dominant IB lens of expatriate, where, which focus on self-efficacy and many of the aspects which might be as well important, possibly not that central to sense making of refugee workforce integration. So I strongly recommend, and I think where research should be looking is go outside of the field of IB, outside of the field of organizational theory and management more broadly, and look at migration studies, sociology, and look at how the challenges of migrations have been theorized there, because I think there is a lot of valuable insight in those stream of work that could enrich, again, our own theorizing. So I think that's one topic. And the second topic is, and that goes very much with what Joe said, refugee workforce integration is a very complex topic. Joe Carter, you in the comment. I think it's really fascinating that we require multi-stakeholder collaborations to address it effectively. And those multi-stakeholders collaborations are very tricky, which means we really need to make sure that we provide as much insights as we can into what works and what doesn't work. What are the conditions under which those multi-sector collaborations can work? And what is the role of those different major stakeholders, as we discussed before, the government, the policymakers, the media, in providing not just the context, because what we are trying to argue, there is more than just the context. They are strongly influencing the decision-making of corporations, of multinationals, including, as to who is considered a valuable workforce, of who is considered a talent pool. And this is what's coming from our research again and again. And we've interviewed now probably 60 different employers. We get to hear, yeah, happy to hire if someone comes to me and asks me to do so. Because traditionally, any minority group is not being seen as a talent pool that you will organically search and reach out to. So the role of the middleman, especially for refugees, we found to be really critical for that entire employment process and hiring to happen in the first place.
Thank you so much, both of you ladies, also for doing the heavy lifting in the Q&A session. Again, I rarely see the chat so on fire, and I really apologize also on behalf of Ida and myself if we cannot get to all your questions now personally. We will save the chat and we'll make sure that we email the speakers the questions as well for your future reference. And the final two questions that I kind of wanted to wrap in one, but I believe you sort of touched upon, and is the importance of low-skilled migration as well, and the study of that. And I think that was Marina, Chi, and Joe, all three of them, and possibly more people in the chat who commented on this, on lower and semi-skilled migration. And also, if any of you, Betina or Stacey, would like to see just a word or two on internal migration, whether you have seen any work on that or whether there's a big gap. This was a question by Marina Schmidt in the chat, and I will stop the questions from after this. So yeah, either one of you, Stacey. Yeah.
Let's see. So yes, I've already addressed the topic of low skilled migration, and where I think that IB has a path dependency problem of looking at primarily expatriation. And I agree with what Betina is saying, where actually we have an opportunity in building theory by relying on international businesses' expertise in understanding how migration happens for expatriates primarily, but using the theory that we learned there and then applying it to, for example, refugees. And then you can look at these extreme cases, as Betina was talking about it, right? The most high status and the most low resource, really, or less supported employees, and looking at where we can see differences, where we can build theory that's more generalizable across all categories of migration in international business. For example, taking some acculturation theories about expatriates and integrating that with a trauma-informed lens and saying, okay, well, how do these things come together? And the second question, I recall, what was the other one?
The internal
migration, right. I mean, I'm seeing the most research that I'm seeing about internal migration is taking place in China from rural to urban. And that's where I really see a lot of vibrant research stream happening about internal migration. Haven't seen as much of it elsewhere, especially not in international business. Betina?
I might start with the latter, which is exactly the challenge. I think back in 2017, when I presented internally at the research seminar, my first ideas about refugee related research, and waited for my colleagues to just smash everything about theory development. Actually, what I heard back as feedback was, these are refugees. This is not international business. This is migration studies. And I remember, kind of sitting down thinking, wow, I did not see that one coming. Well, luckily they were wrong. I was right. But with that in mind, I think there is a lot in terms of our assumptions of what international business and the role of international business is in this context. And I still think that many colleagues and scholars see international business as predominantly being about expatriates. And I think this bias in how we perceive the role of international business is slowly changing because of exactly work like Peter's, when there is a call for addressing those major grand challenges where we need to be important player in providing tangible solutions, because MNCs have the resources, networks, knowledge, and expansion that will allow a lot of interventions, which also brings links to the next question about this internal migration for refugees. While there are over 80 million people that were forcibly displaced, I think only about 30 million of those are refugees in the sense of being internationally displaced. The others are at the fringes of their own countries and borders. So again, I think with the, to kind of not to overestimate the lens of international business, there is a lot in terms of the supply chains management where that internal displacement will play a role. And, Alex and I know the work of IKEA quite well. And IKEA does a lot in terms of enabling those displaced people, including internally displaced people, establishing their own businesses, providing them with resources and with markets to then make sure that they can sustainably what they produce locally sell elsewhere. And that's how many, if you go to IKEA, and, I'm sorry for this kind of almost like a plug-in product placement, they have several ranges of products that have been designed and developed by refugee individuals, including probably internally displaced people, where they sense the market, support the design process, and make sure that those designs can reach the mainstream market. And I think this is the type of multinational perspective we can take, whether it's internally or externally, and forced migration.
Thank you both very much. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, can I just say one more thing? I'm really excited about some of the interest that all of you have in the chat, especially looking at across the power and status spectrum. So I did include a link to another special issue that I'm editing on equality, inclusion, and fairness in international business. I want to encourage you, if you're doing research in this area, to consider submitting there, where migration across the spectrum often has issues with colonialism, with power dynamics and unequal power among employees that is really relevant to an EDI perspective. So check that one out. Thanks.
Thank you, Stacey. So we are closely coming to an end, but I know that Peter Buckley wanted to comment.
Yes, apologies, there's no video, but I'm smiling all the time. It was nice of Betina to mention the grand challenges, because I think this is a really important way forward, because a lot of what we've talked about come under the heading of grand challenges. And there's been a couple of questions in the chat about policy. And I think the idea of the role of multinationals in meeting these grand challenges, because as I've always said, multinationals are part of the problem and also part of the solution. And it's getting those balances right that is important. We're looking at one of the world's greatest grand challenges, and surely we should bring the theory that we have to bear on it. And I think another point that's very good is the point about path dependency. I think it's a matter of taking it much wider than the issues that have been addressed in the literature on expatriates, and looking at these indeed in the grand terms of labour flows as well as in the individual. So it covers the whole spectrum of the different levels that we're looking at grand challenges. So I think this has been a really interesting debate, and apologies that you can't see me enjoying it.
Thank you very much, Peter. So I would like now to thank a lot the speakers and also our wonderful audience for this very thought-provoking conversation and for the many comments in the chat. Also special thanks to Elena Karali from Leeds and Marius Grant from Vienna for all the backstage support in preparation for this webinar. We are sure this will inspire colleagues from across different universities to work on the important issues discussed today. So if you are doing work on migration or you were inspired by today's webinar to shift your focus to it, please feel free to email us and share it with us. Thank you.
And then Sib here, just a huge thanks to all the speakers, and Stacey and Betina have stayed with us until this hour, very early morning hour for Betina, and I guess morning semi-afternoon for Stacey. Again, great inputs, a lot of food for thought, and a topic that we know you have been working on much before the current crisis. So also thank you for the actual dedication and passion to this topic that really, I agree with Peter, needs to be addressed and fully incorporated in IB and management studies. We will stop the recording now. And so we are happy to let people go. Also, just because a lot of the participants here actually are the members of Migration Business and Society community, Aida and I are happy to simply stay around for as much as needed and have an informal conversation or further comments about how things are going within this community. Stacey and Betina are part of that community as well, so you're more than welcome to stay. But also we completely understand if you need to leave. So again, the official part is over, and please feel free to stick around, and simply you can take off your mic and talk to us, or feel free to say goodbye. Thank you one more time.